And I'm sure President Trump has made it very clear we are not interested in a confrontation with Russia. You are pressing ahead with the goal of confronting Russia. That is what the British and the French want to do. However ridiculous it may appear to us, they seem to be quite serious about it.
So recently, Colonel Douglas Macgregor was on Andrew Napolitano's podcast, Judging Freedom, to talk about what would really be required for there to be peace with Russia, despite the whole Ukraine situation. And he makes some good points, especially as it relates to Europe and what they're doing right now. So let's watch and let's react.
Let's talk about the so-called agreement that emanated from the 2.5 hour conversation yesterday between President Trump and President Putin. Do you agree that it's unlikely that they spent 2.5 hours talking about bombing Ukrainian infrastructure, and that they probably spoke about many other things as well? Number one. And number two, is this much of a concession by President Putin?
Oh, of course not. It isn't. And we're not going to get any concessions from President Putin on this matter. I think President Trump made the phone call with the hope that he could persuade President Putin to respond positively in some way to the offer of a ceasefire that we had extracted from Zelensky. And I think he got something like that when there was an agreement to not destroy or attack any more energy infrastructure in Ukraine. But keep in mind that just 6 hours later, the Ukrainians struck energy infrastructure in Russia. So under the circumstances, was that meaningful at all? And I think the answer is probably no. We need to understand something. There's one important point on which President Putin and President Trump agree, and that is that neither of them, under any circumstances, want a war to break out between us. In other words, both men will do whatever they can to avoid a direct confrontation with each other. That is good news, and we should all be grateful that President Trump is in the White House at the moment and not President Biden, because there was no evidence that President Biden and his administration were really interested in avoiding that kind of conflict.
I think Macgregor is just about totally accurate here. One of the things that's interesting is a lot of people kind of look at the Trump administration as just kind of this impartial mediator that could kind of secure a world peace, where when it comes to the Russian perspective and the true perspective is the U.S. is a belligerent in this in terms of supporting one of two parties. The U.S. has been flatly aligned with Zelensky, you know, with an interregnum of 1 week of funding turned off. And Russia's essentially in the driver's seat. It's occupied the territory it wants to. It will not leave the eastern Donbass. It will not leave Crimea. So what it would actually take for the U.S. to secure a peace is potentially turning that spigot of aid off. That's what Trump's instincts led him to do after the meeting with Zelensky, and it was right. So this attempted ceasefire seems counterintuitive if your actual goal is to secure peace with Russia. I don't think we can do it as long as we're one of the two belligerents.
The problem is, how far can we go in terms of admitting that the war is lost, that Putin has won, not Putin, but Russia, that the Russian armed forces are in a position that cannot be effectively attacked by the West, that the Russians can continue to move west if they want to. That's difficult for President Trump to state categorically. And again, it came up that if you really want this to end, President Trump, you've got to stop this flow of military aid and assistance to Ukraine.
Amen.
Not only do you need to stop that, you need to prevail upon your allies to stop it. And thus far, we're seeing a lot of evidence that we have very little influence over our allies. In fact, our so-called allies seem to be determined to chart a separate and distinct path of confrontation with Russia. So this is a very difficult situation. I don't think President Trump alone can solve all of it at this point.
I know it's difficult to try and figure him out because he's often all over the place in what he says and what he does. And maybe the question is unfair, but how can he be asking Vladimir Putin for peace when we are funding a war against him,
Right.
continuing to fund it, not
Right.
with cash, but with the same military levels as Joe Biden was.
Judge, you're preaching to the choir on this one. How many times have I been on your show over the last months, probably the last year, and said repeatedly, the most important thing for us to do to signal our seriousness about this is to end aiding Ukrainians, period, and to get all Americans in and out of uniform, intelligence, civilian, whatever, out of Ukraine. That's still what we need to do. If we do that, then I think we can look forward to a useful discussion with the Russians in terms of what we want to do in Ukraine and ultimately across Europe. But until we reach that point, we understand we've got to do it, nothing fundamentally is going to change.
Yeah, not only is Zelensky's position in his war against Russia strengthened by our support, but it also prevents us from not being viewed as a adversarial power toward the Russians. They're exactly right about this.
That's the point of the discussion. Over the last 24 hours, the only thing we achieved was to agree to a hockey game. That's, I guess, a morale builder, but that fundamentally changed the facts. So I think in the parlance of the neighborhood I grew up in, North Philadelphia, I think Mr. Putin threw Mr. Trump a bone when he said, we'll stop destroying energy infrastructure.
Why do you think President Putin donned military fatigues, traveled to Kursk, and publicly ordered his generals to get this over with? And then they did.
Two things. First of all, in most of the world, not in the United States, not in the United Kingdom, not in much of Western Europe, but in most countries, I think the ministers of defense usually wear a military uniform, even though they haven't previously been long service soldiers. Then the heads of state in virtually almost all countries usually wear some sort of uniform that is military and associated with the armed forces. Now, I don't think I should say all, but certainly the majority. For him as the head of state and the commander in chief to wear a uniform is widely expected in Russia. That's normal. It would be abnormal if he showed up otherwise. And that was to signal the absolute deadly seriousness of the matter. In fact, in 1914, you had Field Marshal Kitchener, who was the Minister of Defense, we would say Minister of War in Great Britain, or First Secretary of War, who went to France to speak to General French, who was commanding the British Expeditionary Force, to tell him, you're not leaving, you're staying, you're going to fight to the bitter end with the French. And uncharacteristically for a First Secretary of State for War, he put on his uniform as a field marshal, went over there and made it clear. So I think this sort of thing signals exactly what you suggested, the absolute seriousness of Putin's determination to put an end to this.
And if you're Zelensky, you wear a military jumpsuit everywhere and sleep with it, and show up to the White House with it while wearing tennis shoes as well. So some countries do it a little bit more than others.
So the Russians agree not to attack Ukrainian energy infrastructure. I guess that means plants that produce energy, hydroelectric plants, nuclear plants, old-fashioned oil-fired plants. But the Ukrainians weren't participating, haven't agreed, and have behaved in the opposite way. Does the U.S., as far as you know, intend to speak to Zelensky and tell him what to do?
I think Zelensky has demonstrated that he is not really responsive to what the president of the United States says. And I think that's evident also within the broader NATO framework. You now have Great Britain and France.
And that would be all right, by the way, if we weren't funding his entire campaign against Putin. If the U.S. withdrew, let him act completely autonomously. That's what non-interventionists want. But if the U.S. is funding this thing, you should probably take a hint from kind of your financier. Otherwise, your whole cause might be ruined.
France, who for all intents and purposes are telling us that they're going to press ahead on a separate avenue of approach into Ukraine. we are not in control. The president of the United States, who's commander in chief of the U.S. Armed Forces, is not in control of all the European forces. NATO itself has broken down. It is not this alliance that is committed to unity of effort and unity of command anymore. So I think the Russians know that. They're not surprised. Unfortunately, the Europeans and Zelensky have made President Trump look silly, to be blunt.
How have they made him look silly? I mean, a lot of your colleagues on this show think he has made them look silly. He's excluded them from negotiations. They're boasting about what aid they can provide Zelensky, which they don't even have. And if they send what they have, the Russians will demolish it.
Well, he's not just the commander in chief of the U.S. Armed Forces. He's effectively the leader of the alliance. And if your alliance is no longer in step with you, and you tell them what you will or will not do, and you tell them not to do something, and I'm sure President Trump has made it very clear, we are not interested in a confrontation with Russia. You are pressing ahead with the goal of confronting Russia. That is what the British and the French want to do. However ridiculous it may appear to us, they seem to be quite serious about it. Now, can it be done? I don't know. They have to go through Germany and Poland in order to reach Western Ukraine, but they seem to be intent on doing that.
This is probably the first point where I'll disagree with Colonel Macgregor, is that I think it's a lot of posturing and chest beating to kind of try to solidify a united front with Ukraine after, so many of the world neocons and, the globalists and the people that want an endless pipeline of funding to Ukraine to come out in solidarity for that. I don't think that any European power intends to actually send troops. I don't think Macgregor really thinks that either, but there certainly is a lot of, empty talk about that, especially, we've seen it from the EU, we've seen it from the Polish authorities, but even if their leaders are saying that stuff, there's just not popular support to, I think, be able to carry that out.
So that means that the alliance is no longer responsive to President Trump. So if you're a Russian, you're looking at this and say, well, it's all fine, well, and good, whatever President Trump says, but he doesn't control the NATO alliance anymore. So we can't expect him to speak for the alliance in terms of what they will or will not do.
Colonel, what is NATO without the United States?
Well, that's the $60,000 question. I don't think it amounts to much. I haven't for a long time. And you've been to Europe many times. We all have. Europe is hardly a uniform construct. Europeans in different parts of Europe see the world very differently. If you're in Rome and you look at the world from the perspective of Italy, is Italy remotely interested in a war in Russia? Of course not.
And imagine how much farther the U.S. is, and so many people here seem to be so interested in a war with Russia. It's a product of Russiagate and all the propaganda you hear about Putin trying to reconstitute the U.S. and that America has to be the sole policeman of the world and kind of spread our ideas, export democracy, and it's all junk. It's all foreign policy junk that, I've had to live with my entire life.
Same is true for Spain, and I would argue the same is true for Paris. And President Macron is making a serious mistake by seeing it otherwise. He's out of touch with reality and out of touch with his own population. And of course, I think the British are viewing all of this in the way that perhaps we are. What are we doing on the ground in Ukraine? That doesn't make any sense. Now, the British historically have relied on their naval power, but they're a much diminished naval power. They can't blockade the Russians. They can't control what goes in and out of Russian ports anymore. So the bottom line is NATO doesn't amount to very much without us. Now, that doesn't have to be a permanent condition. And I'm beginning to hear indications from the president and his administration that we're quite prepared to live with a new 4-star supreme commander of NATO in Mons, who is not an American, which I applaud.
Yeah,
because at some point, the Europeans have to take responsibility for themselves. They're talking the talk, but they're not walking the walk.
All right, so I'll have to adjust my my small critique of Macgregor earlier, it's clear he's well aware of the situation here and how the dynamics are different between the chest beating and the realities of kind of European intervention in Ukraine.
So I think ultimately they'll end up looking ridiculous. But in the meantime, they're embarrassing us because they are theoretically led by us within the NATO framework. And that's not the way people are behaving.
Colonel, do you see any connection, whether political or emotional, between the two decisions within 2 days, one to by Donald Trump, one to unleash Netanyahu, and the other to talk peace with Putin?
There is a difference, and we need to understand this. The people who are arguing to back the Greater Israel Project, even if it involves war with the United States, between Iran and the United States, Egypt and the United States, whoever in the region doesn't support the Greater Israel Project, is the following. There are some key assumptions that both Washington and the government in Jerusalem have agreed to, or essentially sign up for. Number one assumption is that the Arabs, Turks, Persians, all the Muslims in the region, in the final analysis, are cowed by us. They're afraid of us. We can bully them. We can bribe them. We can drive them in whatever direction we want them to go. Number one, they will not fight back. Number two, that as long as the United States Armed Forces are in the area and back Israel, that the United States Armed Forces, together with Israel, are invincible and invulnerable in the Middle East. And I think the third is that ultimately the rest of the world will indulge us, that everyone else will go along with it because they have no choice. Those three assumptions have not been invalidated. Thus far, if you stand back for the region and you look at it from Mr. Netanyahu's standpoint, and I think Mr. Trump shares this view, the people in the region have not fought back. They have not directly challenged the destruction, the mass murder and expulsion of people in Gaza, or presumably in the West Bank, in southern Lebanon, or anywhere else. It simply hasn't happened. And so they're right. They think they can get away with this and bully anybody. When you move to Eastern Europe, that's a different environment completely. We are not in a position to challenge the Russians militarily in Ukraine. And I think there's an awareness behind the scenes that if we try to do that, we will lose that confrontation. And so there's a willingness to do business in Ukraine that's different from doing business in the Middle East, where we think we reign supreme.
That is so true. There's such a difference, rattling sabers with a nuclear power than kind of joining up against helpless Palestinians in the slaughter in Gaza. So Douglas Macgregor is so right on this. He's so accurate when it comes to the fact that what a peace will require is a elimination of U.S. aid to Ukraine. And it's because of the fact that Zelensky will have no other choice. We just saw this week as Putin kind of agreed, as Macgregor put it, threw a bone to Trump and Ukraine by saying, I won't target energy infrastructure. That's a huge deal to the innocents of Ukraine, who would suffer immensely from a lack of energy flow. But to Zelensky, he doesn't really care, because the only thing Zelensky wants, and he can't possibly obtain, is the culturally Russian territory he lost in the East Donbass. He's not getting that back under any agreement. Russia has it occupied under lockdown. The only change in that would have to come from U.S. boots on the ground or European boots on the ground, none of which is going to happen. That's like pigs flying. So it's really going to take a withdrawal of U.S. aid to Ukraine, I think, to solidify a peace with Russia. Trump's instinct on that was good after he met with Zelensky and kind of told him out in the Oval Office for the whole world to see. But then he made a mistake by restoring it in the hope of this fruitless ceasefire that Russia never would have agreed to. That seems to have been a gambit by the people who want the war to continue, hoping that, Putin responded to it in a way that makes him look worse than most of the U.S. sees him at this point. So that's what I think. I would like to hear from what you guys think, though. Let me know in a comment below. How will the peace process develop in Russia, and is Macgregor right? Does the US just need to withdraw all aid to Ukraine, and that's the best hope for peace? I'd like to hear from you. Let me know in the comments. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and until I see you next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Take care, guys. Peace out.